Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the latest update, which is, I think we can call it a series now. It's three now. It's definitely a series, three. So our series of monthly updates. This one's the 24th of March 2015. And as you can see by the first slide, it's dominated by Vanuatu. That's our new deployment at the moment. Well, let's figure out what we're doing. In fact, before we do that, I'm convinced I'm just talking to myself, but someone sent me some questions in, and one of them was, do the shelter box tents link together to form a larger dwelling? We did have Vango produce a sheet that attached 4 tents. If you park them back to back, it would attach all 4 tents, so you had kind of a little area at the back of the tents to form a separate living area. But it was just as expensive as having another tent, so we didn't go forward with that. But I'm reliably told that if you are very, very careful and you can set all of the porches, that all of the porches are next to each other, so you get almost like a covered living space with the 4 porches together, if you want to do that, although that's a little bit close, even for family. So do send in your questions to ALFE, that's alfie, at shelterbox.org, and mainly just to convince me that I'm not talking to myself here, but also if you've got anything that needs explaining, whether it was contained in this presentation or anything that just pops into your head about anything we do from a shelterbox operations point of view. Again, we apologise for the rattling and stomping. It is a live warehouse. We've got a crane outside today removing stuff, and we've just had a big load of shelter kits arrive, which are being stacked in the warehouse. So, shelterbox operations, what are we doing today? Well, there we go, there's the map. Very similar to last month, because we only got Vanuatu, which is at the bottom right, which is so small. I think I've even coloured in New Caledonia on that map, because Vanuatu isn't big enough to take a shade on that little map. We've got Vanuatu and we've got Malawi ongoing, which is in its 2nd month now. The rest of it, still looking at the flooding in South America, which has gone down somewhat, but with it being an El Nino year, we're looking at more flooding as the springtime moves the storms further north. Gaza continues. Ukraine, we're still monitoring, although we've not had a lot of feedback from Ukraine. The war continues there. And pretty much all of the others. Cameroon is starting to approach now, and we're looking at the security sign-off to get our team safely into Cameroon and limiting what they do there to remain within our risk appetite. So that's it. All of our aid that's going to the DPRK is now on the sea, and we are starting to get communication from the embassy about sending a team there and all the permissions that have to be filled out for that. So, Vanuatu. Last week, Cyclone Pam was a Category 5 storm that was just going to brush Vanuatu with heavy rain, but decided to jink west and went over some warmer water and spun up to be a Category 5. For all those who are fortunate enough not to know what a Category 5 cyclone is, that is, or in this case it was winds gusting up to 185 miles an hour. So that's pretty much getting up to high-end standards of wind, and considering a fully loaded jumbo jet can take off less than that, you could fly a jumbo jet like a kite in wind like that. That's from the people I've spoken to on in Hainan in the Philippines. It will lift people who are crawling across the ground and throw them through the air. So that's the amount of wind that they were forcing. Luckily, there was not such a large storm surge, so a lot of deaths were avoided. And I think there's less than 25 deaths because of the limited storm surge there. But a lot of people affected. Numbers vary. There's a couple of figures on the screen there. 65,000 in need of emergency shelter. I've seen figures higher than that. Our team were dispatched from Australia and New Zealand, a 2-person team. They arrived in Vanuatu as soon as the civilian airport was open after the damage, and spaces were available on the flight. We've hooked up with an agency called Care International and Care Australia, all part of the same group. They can provide people on the ground, offices, know-how, relationships with the government, permissions to operate. And because of the unique way that we're funded, we can provide shelter kits that have been funded up front through our generous donors that we've moved into now. We don't know where the storms are going to hit, so we had shelter box tents and boxes pre-positioned in Australia, but they're not needed at this time. The people who are the government and the main aid agencies have decided that shelter kits are the way forward because they provide the rebuild and also they're cheaper, so they can provide a wider response. We have to fit in with that response to get the permission to operate. We are flying shelter kits from Sabang in Malaysia, where we had them pre-positioned. We're looking at moving further non-food items and possibly some MIDI tents from Dubai and the UK. But 1,000 shelter kits are in the process. We've got about 2/3 of that load has arrived in Brisbane for the air bridge into Vanuatu. The remaining about 400 shelter kits out of that 1,000 will arrive tomorrow. Then the load can be split down and put onto the small aircraft that fly into Vanuatu. The team have already been out and assessed on the outlying islands. And this is the kind of damage that they're looking at. They're talking about 90% devastation in some areas. People who they were on the plane with who knew the islands were bursting into tears at the amount of devastation. If you want to look at more pictures, please go to the website. We've got our great comms team putting up stories, and they're feeding new images that the team will be sending back once they've got the internet going. We've got a very organised cluster. It's also quite tight-knit, so that's why we've got to fit in with what they do. And on the slide there, we're mentioning about the MIDI tents and the tarpaulins that we're sending with the MIDI tents to provide extra shelter from the sun and also extra protection from the rain. Now, our special guest star, and he's raising his eyebrows at that already, is Dave Ray, who pretty much is very much at the heart of why Shelterbox is going down or adding to its range of kit that it can offer, the shelter kit. Dave's just come out from Malawi, where he was the shelter deputy lead, and we'll come to him again later on in this presentation. Why are we using shelter kits? Talk us through it.
Yes, as Alf says, I'm Dave Ray, and I will now talk to you about some shelter kits. So, shelter kits are a very common item within the sort of aid industry, and especially within the shelter sector. They were developed by the IFRC, which is the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and are a very common item. They're new to Shelterbox. But as I say, they're very common throughout the industry. This is not an item that we're going to use to replace tents in any way, or to replace shelter boxes, or to move away from either of those items. But they are items that can assist families in a different way in different scenarios where tents are not necessarily quite so appropriate or needed. As we can see by the picture there, it contains a number of items. You have 2 4x6 metre tarpaulins to provide coverage, and then you have things like a shovel and some rope and a hoe and tin snips, a hammer, a saw, and then just as importantly, we have a bit of a suite of fixings involved there. So we've got 2 different types of normal nails, and then we've also got some roofing nails and some tie wire. And just as importantly, on the bottom right of that picture, you can see what is in fact an instruction sheet of how you can utilise this kit in various methodologies to help rebuild your shelter. So basically there are two main ways that you can use a shelter kit. The first way is that you can build a shelter from scratch on land that has been identified and allocated. That will often need the sort of extra implementation of things like timber, or any building materials that can either be given by a government or an aid agency, or can be salvaged by the beneficiary population themselves. The second method is that it can be used to repair an existing structure. So a lot of times when agencies go into the field, you see damage to people's houses, as we have here in Paraguay from last year. So this was a flooding event. These are not the people's normal houses. They were displaced into the centre of the city from the outskirts when the river flooded and burst its banks there. They were given some materials by the government and built their own small sort of temporary shelters within the city themselves, on land allocated by the government. So this was all in sort of public space on the side of roads, in parks and all sorts of places like that. So when Shelterbox arrived there, it was very quickly clear that there was no space to put tents for these people, and taking down these makeshift temporary shelters that they built and replacing them with tents really wasn't a particularly cost-effective or viable solution for anybody, because they were already living in them. Shelterbox didn't distribute the shelter kits to this population until 2 months after the flooding event. So as you can see there, what really happened was that the shelter kits that Shelterbox was able to distribute there really helped in order to help those families to make those structures better. So that was the first real kind of impact that the shelter kits had. They were able to waterproof their structures, they were able to windproof their structures, and generally make them a little bit more habitable. Now, the sort of secondary knock-on effect from shelter kits is they also will tie into the recovery process in a really, really good way for these people. So not only were the people able to rebuild their shelters and have somewhere warm and dry to live, they were able to use the tools to go about their livelihoods. They were able to build things to help them go and earn a living. They were able to use the tools in there to clear the ground around them, to provide drainage, to do all sorts of things that you know, a standard deployment like Shelterbox wouldn't normally be able to access and do. So that was really one of the first times that we deployed shelter kits as called in by a response team. We think they went extremely well. The beneficiary population were extremely happy with them. And so this is an example of kind of the second aspect of shelter kits, where they're helping to rebuild their existing structures and just to make them a little bit better than they were before. Another little look at the shelter kits is one that we saw in Malawi very recently. This is a part of the ongoing response that we have in Malawi at the moment, where the IFRC, again the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, is or had designed this particular little shelter to be used in conjunction with a shelter kit. So as you can see there, the frame inside is made of wood, which was bought on the local market. Now they went to quite a lot of trouble to make sure that the wood there was sustainably sourced. You see these wooden poles fairly regularly all around in Malawi. So again, this is an example of the first type of intervention you can do with a shelter kit, where people who have been really displaced, they're not in the place that they were originally, and they have no real plans to go back. So they're in camp type scenarios. Will be given training and materials to help self-build themselves one of these little shelters as a temporary emergency measure until something else can be found to really help them into their recovery and rebuild process.
Right, and that's Malawi. Moving seamlessly on, also what we're doing in Malawi now. We've been in there for a couple of months now. Flooding began in January earlier this year. 173,000 people displaced, quite a few people killed, and we are up to, I think we're beyond 700 boxes now that we've deployed in Malawi. We also deployed Dave Ray in a departure for Shelterbox in that earlier in the year. We'd sent him on a cluster lead course, and he was invited to become part of the cluster, so that's kind of working separately from Shelterbox but part of the overall effort. Part of the shelter cluster. So you're going to believe that I'm asking you for the first time, but what is the shelter cluster, Dave, and why were you needed out there?
Okay, thank you, El. So the shelter cluster is essentially the group of agencies that are working together on any response, or working independently on any response. So that really is what the shelter cluster is. It's made up of the agencies who are responding in that context. It's a system that's been in place for a few years now. and there are, I think, 11 clusters, including shelter. So you have shelter, water and sanitation, protection, emergency telecommunications, all education, all sorts of things. So different agencies specialise in different aspects of an all-round humanitarian response. So obviously we are a part of the shelter cluster, and I was deployed by the global shelter cluster, which is run by, again, the IFRC. In instances of natural disasters, in conflicts, it's run by UNHCR. And really our role in the cluster is to coordinate the actions and directions of the agencies who are operating. So really, in the really early stages of a disaster, my role as a regional coordinator was to really go to each of these affected districts and promote coordination mechanisms. What tends to happen at the start of all disasters is everybody just rushes in there and starts doing their own thing, and nobody tells everybody what each other's are doing, and you get an awful lot of overlap and confusion and a mixing of styles and approaches. So in order to provide a kind of coherent response and approach and set standards for agencies to adhere to and to provide technical advice to agencies. This is why that cluster team is deployed. My role, as I say, really was to get people in the same room at the same time talking about shelter issues, and then to advise them on the best ways forward, what the government was saying at the national level, what the differences were between each district, because everybody is working in a microcosm, and I was one of the very few people that had a regional overview. So I was advising both the agencies in the districts, but I was also advising back up to the capital level about what was going on in the district. So I was sort of eyes and ears on the ground as well. It was a really, really fascinating time. Whether it was successful or not remains to be seen. It's a very interestingly intangible role, because you don't actually do anything. You don't deliver shelter. You don't help people as such physically. You are just trying to coordinate those agencies that are. When I arrived there were no shelter cluster activities whatsoever. When I left there were in most areas that I were working in. They were fledgling, but I believe they are getting better. So I think it was a very useful and interesting thing for me to do. I'm very grateful to Alf and the rest of the managerial staff here at Shelterbox for allowing me to do it. I think it very much helped Shelterbox in their deployment to Malawi, because we were able to give them a very broad overview of what was happening in the larger context within that flooding, and were able to direct our teams to places that were underserved by other agencies, and as a result we've had a very successful deployment there, and our reputation within the industry has gone up quite a lot, and I think that's due to the teams that came in and coordinated very well with me, and then continued to coordinate very well with the subsequent person that replaced me. So the first time that Shelterbox has done this, I think and I hope that we will continue to engage in this process. I think we have a lot to offer this process, and I think it offers Shelterbox an awful lot as well to be very, very involved in these processes from the start.
Well, thanks a lot, Dave. So, the field update is 786. There we are, that's as of this morning. Chikawawa, we've stopped deploying there. We've filled the need that we agreed to. We've got 500 shelter kits with Islamic Relief that we're hoping to distribute in the near future. We've got 20 school boxes arriving tomorrow. And a lot of the schools have been part of that shelter process because that's where people have been living. So the school boxes will help all the pupils that have had equipment destroyed, but it also keeps the school system engaged with the shelter process. It keeps everybody smiling. Zomba continues, 530 boxes. There was a big meeting last week with the shelter cluster, and that was the local government wanted to close down camps that have been set up and move the problem elsewhere and move everybody home. The aid agencies involved with shelter disagreed, and they wanted to continue serving those camps and also provide people with the boxes so they could go home when those sites became available when the water had receded. The main government agreed with that, and things are continuing on a pace. So again, that's an example of where the cluster comes in. It provides a forum for a collected viewpoint to be aired and discussed. Anyway, moving on from Falombe, and in fact, before we do that, if you look at the photographs there, I mean, these are the challenges that we're up against. The transport network is very rudimentary in Malawi, and that's one of the reasons that we're up to 786 boxes, but we're in our third month. Everything slows down. We're trying to do it safely. And when you've got rivers like that every few miles, you're going to have to stop, unload the vans, carry them across, and then find new transport on the other side. Nepal, we've got a monitoring and evaluation trip in Nepal. We sent out the distribution in August. We've got our new prototype tents, which are the ones in the photograph on the right there. And we want to know how they're doing. They've been up 6 months now, so we'll be able to see whether the manufacturer's claims that it's as hard-wearing or more hard-wearing than our ordinary shelter box tents, which are in the other photographs, or whether we want to be sure that that's a claim in the real world before we start buying larger numbers of those and sending them out to beneficiaries. That's going reasonably well. The team's still in the field. Everything's coming back okay with that. We're quite pleased with the preliminary results we're getting back from Nepal. Remote Gaza, we now have had news where all 500 boxes that we sent have been distributed. We're in talks now to see what we can do next, and we are expecting more detailed reports and pictures in the next couple of weeks. Niger, the bottom left-hand corner of the country, we have got another 448 heading towards there. And they'll be distributing in the Tillaberi region. It was for flooding. My thoughts are turning to, is that flooding still happening? What's going on there? Because we've got a bigger crisis in the bottom right-hand corner where all the Boko Haram violence is. So we are talking to Plan Niger about what's going on and this two-pronged disaster that we've got going on in Niger and where we go next. Cameroon, we have got a team going in there in the next few weeks. We're just going through the security options and what our area of operation can be. Syria is almost continually happening. ACTED and Hand in Hand for Syria are distributing, and we're exploring alternative pipelines. Pakistan distributions continue, 1,000 224 shelter boxes. Information is very slow coming out of Pakistan, but we continue to press there. North Korea, as I've said, all the stuff is now on the sea, and the team will be going in there probably April, May time. And that pretty much is it, with about 5.5 minutes to spare. So there you go. You get a little bit less than normal. That's about it, really. What we're looking at the moment is we've got a double El Nino year. We're still in cyclone season in the Pacific. Australia's getting hit by a cyclone. So we're quite stretched for volunteers at the moment. We've got a large deployment in Malawi, which will probably go on for another month. Vanuatu seems to be expanding. We're looking at putting a team of 4 in the next week when the equipment arrives and distributions start to happen. Hopefully we'll be able to get the MIDI tents there in time, so it could even go bigger than that. And apart from that, we are very reactive. We don't know where we're going to be next week. Something could be happening right now. We don't know. So that's about it from me. Please send us your questions. As I've said, if only just to convince me that I'm not talking to myself in here. And hopefully we're with you in a month's time. Thank you very much for listening. And that's it from me, Dave and Liv, who I still can't convince to speak. Thank you very much. See you next time.